My hip had been acting up again, the kind of dull, grinding ache that shows up uninvited every November when the temperature drops past zero and doesn't leave until April. I was 64 years old and standing in the parking lot of a Shoppers Drug Mart in Sudbury, Ontario, transferring a money order into an envelope I'd already addressed 3 times in the past week, just to make sure the postal code was right. My younger brother had been dead for 3 years, and every month without fail, I sent his widow $800. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do it because anyone asked me to. I did it because my brother was the kind of man who would have done it for me, and because his daughter was 7 years old and deserved piano lessons and winter boots that actually fit. I did it because I'd promised him at his funeral, in my head, standing in the rain at Lakeview Cemetery, while the priest said words that sounded like they'd been written for someone else. My brother's name was Patrick. He was 51 when he died. A construction foreman, solid as a load-bearing wall. The kind of man who showed up early and left late and never once complained about either. He died when a section of scaffolding collapsed at a job site outside of Sault Ste. Marie. The investigation took 7 months and concluded it was a combination of equipment failure and contractor negligence. His wife received a settlement that sounded large until you subtracted the legal fees and divided it across a lifetime. She had no family in Ontario. Her parents were in Nova Scotia, both in poor health themselves. She was 38, alone, with a second grader and a mortgage. So I sent $800 a month. It wasn't nothing. I was retired from the post office and living on a pension that covered my needs, but not much else. But it was manageable if I didn't travel, which I hadn't in years anyway. My wife passed in 2019. I wasn't going anywhere. For 3 years, this is how it went. I'd get the money order on the second Tuesday of the month at the same Shoppers, drive it to the same mailbox on Elm Street, drop it in, and go home and make myself a coffee and sit by the window and feel, for a little while, like I was still useful in some way that mattered. Patrick's widow. I'll call her my sister-in-law because that's who she was to me. Would text a thank you every month. Sometimes just a heart emoji. Sometimes a photo of my niece holding a drawing she'd made at school or standing in her hockey gear outside the arena. I kept every photo. I have a folder on my phone still called Lily Updates. My niece's name is Lily, and she has Patrick's eyes, which is something I can look at for a long time. Last October, my neighbor knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon. His name is Walter, and he's 71, a retired electrician who moved here from Timmins 15 years ago. We aren't close friends exactly, but we've shoveled each other's driveways and watched each other's houses and shared a case of beer on the back porch enough times that I trust him. He was uncomfortable standing on my front step. He had his hands in his pockets, which is something Walter does when he doesn't know how to start a sentence. "You still sending money to Patrick's wife?" he asked. I said yes. I said it the way you say something you aren't ashamed of. He nodded slowly. He looked past me into the house, then back at me. "There's something I think you should know," he said, "and I want you to understand that I wouldn't be telling you if I wasn't sure." I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table and told me that his daughter, who lives in Barrie and works as a property manager, had been contacted 2 months earlier by a leasing office in Burlington. They were processing a rental application for a couple and needed to verify some employment information. The application listed 2 adults, a woman whose name matched my sister-in-law's name exactly, and a man. The man's name on the application was listed as her common-law partner. Walter's daughter hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was a routine call. But then she mentioned it to Walter in passing during Thanksgiving dinner, and Walter had remembered Patrick, remembered me talking about the money, and put it together. I sat with that for a moment. "Maybe she's moved on," I said. "She's young, she's allowed to." "That's not the part I'm telling you," Walter said. He looked at his coffee cup. The man on the application, his description, his age. He paused. My daughter said she looked him up because something felt off. The phone number he listed for employment references. It went to a cell, not a business. She found a Facebook profile. He slid his phone across the table to me. I looked at the photo for a long time. The man in the photo was heavier than I remembered. He had a beard he hadn't had before. He was standing on a dock somewhere, a lake I didn't recognize, with a beer in his hand, squinting into the sun. But the way he was standing, his left shoulder dropped lower than his right, just slightly. The way it always had since a hockey injury in his 20s that never fully healed. I'd grown up watching that shoulder. I set Walter's phone down on the table very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands aren't working right. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out in a register I didn't recognize. Walter left after a while. I don't remember what else we said. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window where I usually drink my coffee, and I stared at the street, and I went through every month of the past 3 years in my head like I was auditing something. $800 times 36 months. $28,800. I thought about every text message, every heart emoji, every photo of Lily in her hockey gear. I thought about Patrick's funeral. I thought about standing at that grave in the rain. I thought about the promise I'd made to a man I thought was dead. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I spent 32 years delivering mail, which is work that rewards patience and routine. But I am also my father's son, and my father had a saying that I heard 100 times growing up in Kapuskasing: quiet doesn't mean soft. I decided I needed to see it with my own eyes before I did anything else. I told myself this was the reasonable approach, the responsible one. I told myself there might be an explanation I hadn't considered. I told myself a lot of things over the next week while I drove to Burlington on a Thursday, checked into a Comfort Inn off the QEW, and spent 2 days watching an apartment building on Brand Street from a Tim Hortons across the road. The first day, nothing. The second morning, a little before 9, I saw her come out of the building with Lily. My niece was wearing a pink backpack, and her hair was in 2 braids, and she was talking, animated, the way kids that age always are. My sister-in-law was on her phone. She flagged down a cab, not an Uber, an actual cab, and they got in and left. I sat with my coffee and felt something hollow moving around behind my ribs. An hour later, he came out. He was wearing a construction vest. The irony of it hit me later, and work boots, carrying a coffee thermos. He walked to a truck parked on the street. A newer truck, F-150, dark green. He looked both ways before he got in, the way a man does when he's made a habit of checking who's watching. I didn't approach him. I sat there and I watched him pull out and drive away, and I wrote down the license plate in the Notes app on my phone, and then I put the phone down and pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed through my nose the way my doctor told me to when my blood pressure was a concern. I drove home that afternoon. I had a lot of time to think on the 400 North. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Sudbury, I had decided on 3 things. First, I was not going to do anything impulsive. Second, I was going to call my lawyer, a woman named Sandra who had handled my wife's estate and who I trusted completely. And third, I was going to send one more money order. Not because I owed it, but because I wanted what came next to happen on my terms, not out of a reaction I couldn't take back. Sandra picked up on the second ring. I laid it out for her the way I'd laid it out in my head on the drive home. The scaffolding accident, the death certificate, the settlement, the 36 months of payments, the photo on Facebook, the apartment in Burlington. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a pause. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said carefully, "we're talking about fraud. Potentially also insurance fraud. If he was a named beneficiary on any workplace life policy." She paused again. "Do you know if there was a life insurance component to the construction settlement?" I didn't know for certain, but Patrick had always been responsible about that kind of thing. It was likely. "Don't contact him directly," Sandra said. "Not yet. Let me make some calls first." I thanked her and hung up and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while. The neighbor's kids were playing road hockey on the cul-de-sac. One of them waved at me. I waved back. The following week, Sandra called me back with information that made the hollow feeling behind my ribs collapse into something harder and colder. The workplace life insurance policy had paid out $240,000 before taxes. My sister-in-law had been the sole beneficiary. $240,000, plus the tort settlement, plus $28,800 of my pension money, plus whatever else I wasn't aware of. My brother had staged his own death and left his daughter to fund a new life in Burlington. I want to say that what I felt was rage. It would be simpler to describe it that way. But the truth is, it was more like grief. The same grief I'd felt 3 years ago. And I was angry at that too. I had already mourned him. I had already gone through the part where you reorganize your life around an absence, and now I had to do it again, except this time the person was alive and had chosen this, had looked at everything we were to each other and made a calculation. Sandra moved quickly. She had contacts through a colleague who specialized in insurance litigation, and within 2 weeks, a formal report had been filed with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board and with the insurance company. The Burlington address gave investigators somewhere to start. I didn't know exactly what happened next in a legal sense, because Sandra shielded me from most of it, which I was grateful for. What I know is that he was located, that there were conversations involving lawyers on multiple sides, that the insurance company pursued recovery of the payout aggressively, the way insurance companies do when fraud is confirmed. What I also know is that my sister-in-law, his wife, the woman who had sent me heart emojis for 3 years, had known, not just recently. From the beginning. I found that out on a Tuesday in late November when she called me. I almost didn't answer. I stared at her name on my phone screen for 4 rings and then I picked up. She started with, "I'm so sorry." She said it twice before I said anything. I let her keep going because I had decided before I answered that I was going to let her say what she wanted to say without interrupting. Because I had spent 32 years being patient, and I was going to spend 5 more minutes that way. She told me they'd been planning to leave for over a year before the accident, that the marriage had been in collapse, that there were debts I hadn't known about, gambling debts, specifically significant ones, and that when the scaffolding accident happened and she found herself listed as next of kin in an emergency, something shifted in both of them. She used the phrase, "It felt like a sign." She said they talked about it from his hospital bed, where he was recovering from a broken collarbone and a concussion, and by the time he was discharged, they'd made the decision. "And Lily," I said, was the first thing I said. A long pause. "Lily doesn't know," she said. "She thinks the same as everyone else." That was the part that broke something open in me that I don't think is going to close completely. Lily is 9 years old. She has carried her father's death for 3 years. She drew pictures at school for her father's memory, and her mother mailed me photos of them. And all of it was performance. I asked about the money I'd sent. My sister-in-law said she would pay it back. All of it. That she wanted to. That she knew it didn't make anything right. I didn't say anything to that. Sandra later confirmed that civil recovery was already underway as part of the broader fraud process, so the question of repayment wasn't going to rest on anyone's word. I asked if I could still see Lily. There was another pause, a longer one. "Yes," she said, "I think Lily should still know you. I don't know how things will resolve for Lily in the long run. I don't know what she'll be told, or when, or who will explain to a 9-year-old why her father isn't dead after all, and what that means about the years she spent believing he was. I think about that a lot. I think about it more than I think about the money, which surprised me about myself. What I've settled on is this. I did what I did because I loved my brother, and because Lily deserved stability, and because a promise made at a graveside is still a promise. The fact that I was deceived doesn't undo any of that. It says something about me that I don't regret sending the money, even now. Maybe that's foolish. My friend Walter thinks it's foolish. Sandra thinks it's something else. I think it's just the way I'm built, which is probably too late to change at 64. My hip still aches in November. I still go to the same shoppers on the second Tuesday of the month, out of habit mainly, and buy myself a bad coffee from the machine by the door, and stand in the parking lot for a few minutes before I drive home. I don't send money orders anymore, but last month Lily's school had a winter concert, and her mother sent me a video of her singing in the choir. She's in the front row, a little off-key, absolutely focused. She still has Patrick's eyes. I watched it 4 times. I keep thinking about the moment I set Walter's phone down on my kitchen table. Not the photo itself, though. That's burned in too, but the way my hands moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Like some part of me already knew that if I put it down carefully enough, I could keep what came next from breaking loose all at once. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, and the thing I come back to, more than the money, more than the legal process, more than any of it, is this. I didn't do anything wrong. I did what a decent person does when someone they love leaves a gap behind. I showed up. I sent the envelope. I kept the promise. And the fact that I was lied to doesn't change the character of what I did. It only reveals the character of what they did. There's a version of this story where I become bitter, where I decide that generosity is a vulnerability and kindness is something people take advantage of, and I close myself off accordingly. I understand that version. I'm 64 years old, and I gave away $28,000 of my pension to a man who was alive the whole time. Bitterness would be a reasonable response, but I don't think it would be an honest one. What I've come to believe, not from any book, not from anyone telling me how to feel, just from sitting in that chair by the window long enough, is that the choices we make when no one is watching are the ones that actually build us. I sent that money every month for 3 years and nobody knew except me and my bank account. There was no audience. There was no reward. There was just me deciding month after month that Lily deserved stability and that Patrick's memory deserved to be honored. And acting on that even when it cost me something real. That consistency. Holding to what you believe is right even when it's inconvenient, even when it's expensive, even when you're tired and your hip aches and February in Sudbury feels like it's going to last forever. I think that's what keeps a person intact. Not happy necessarily, not comfortable, but intact. The harder thing to reckon with is what I missed. The signs were there. Walter's daughter noticed something was off from a single phone call. I had 3 years of small details. The door always answered but never opened wider. The texts that came fast and then stopped, the way my sister-in-law never once mentioned struggling financially despite the modest amount I was sending, and I didn't put them together because I didn't want to. I trusted because it was easier than questioning, and I think that's the part I owe myself some honest accounting on. Caring about people doesn't mean suspending your judgment. You can be generous and clear-eyed at the same time. You can hold someone in your heart and still pay attention to what they're actually doing. I'm not sure I understood that before. I do now. And then there's Lily. 9 years old, front row of the choir, a little off-key. She carried her father's death for 3 years and never knew she was carrying a lie. What happens to her next isn't something I control, but I know I'm going to show up for her anyway, carefully, appropriately, with Sandra's guidance on what's legally and practically possible. Because she didn't choose any of this, and she still has Patrick's eyes, and some things you just don't walk away from. I drove home from Burlington on a gray October afternoon with a kind of clarity that only comes after something breaks. Not happy, not whole, but clear. And I've learned that clear is enough to start from.